First of all, welcome everyone, and good afternoon, good morning if you're joining us either from Europe or from the Gulf. So it's a pleasure. We have about 1 hour together to discuss with Dr. Emma Soubrier about her book, her new book, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates: Diverging Paths to Regional and Global Powers. Just a few words of introduction before we get directly to the discussion here. This is a book which reflects, I believe, more than a decade of work, of research conducted by Dr. Soubrier. I think it also reflects, as an academic snapshot, the evolution of, I would say, Middle East scholarship, and more specifically, the growth of, I could say, Gulf studies. The book quotes one of the famous scholars from the UAE, Abdel Khalik Abdallah, who more than 15 years ago, I think, coined the expression "the Gulf moment," and to a certain extent, I think the book is the consequence of this Gulf moment. So, and more specifically, looking at two case studies which are fascinating on their own term, but as the people here working in Singapore are also very closely following Qatar and UAE, which to a certain extent are the biggest partners of Singapore in the region when it comes to trade and diplomacy. So there's definitely going to be a big interest from our Singaporean colleagues here on the topic. Before we move directly, as I said, to the discussion on the book itself, let me just introduce Dr. Soubrier. She's currently the director of the PRISME initiative, which is a research network, research consortium, if I can use the expression, that focuses on different ways to look at the Middle East, and especially security issues in the Middle East. She's also an associate researcher with the Institute for Peace and Development at the University of Côte d'Azur, which is in the south of France, in Nice, and an associated researcher with the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Let me say that she also held various positions in the past in the US, in DC, where she was a visiting scholar at George Washington University, as well as the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Let me also say she was formerly a policy advisor at the French Ministry of Defense Policy Planning Unit. To our audience, the way we will proceed, we will first start a conversation with Dr. Soubrier, where she will explain more about the book, the origins, and so on. If you have questions, you can already send them, write them in the chat box, and then I will collect them in the second half of our discussion. So feel free anytime to start writing them, and I'll make sure, depending on the time we have, to ask them directly to Dr. Soubrier. Now, without further ado, let's start our discussion. And the first question I had, Emma, is a very classic question, which I admit is always out of curiosity for the reasons why researchers look at a specific topic. And so the first question is really about the origins of the project. As I mentioned, this book has been in the making, I assume, more or less for more than a decade. So I'd be curious, and I'm sure our participants would be curious to know more about what actually brought you to Qatar and the UAE. So could you, as a starting point, share with us the origin story of the book?
Everyone, it is a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to present my book for the first time. And as you just mentioned, Jean-Loup, I mean, this book has been more than a decade in the making, and in terms of, origin story of the book, I need to talk about the origin story of my PhD, because the book is largely based on my PhD research that happened from 2012 through 2017. And so I think, first of all, what I need to mention is, although I've been working on the Middle East for a very long time, for almost 2 decades actually, the Gulf was not my first entry into the Middle East, and for a while I was really focused more on the Levant between 2010 and 2009 and 2011. I spent a little bit more than a year in the Levant. I was in Palestine and then Lebanon and Syria, and it's actually very relevant to what happened after. I did a research at that time on Lebanon, and I was working on the Lebanese armed forces, but not from a purely military perspective, but also for the other stories that the Lebanese armed forces were telling. And in Lebanon, my research showed that a lot of the population was thinking of the Lebanese armed forces as a backbone of national identity. Other, national institutions were not perceived as illustrative of the entire nation, etc. And so that got me thinking about, what other stories, military or, military topics actually tell. And so that's something that you find a lot in my PhD research and in the book. Well, and so fast forward at the end of my master's program in 2011, that's when I was picking my PhD topic. And at that time, of course, you all know what was happening in the region. 2011 was the so-called Arab Spring. And what really struck me at the time is how much suddenly we were hearing a whole lot more about Qatar and the UAE. Saudi Arabia, of course, had already, we knew already a lot about Saudi Arabia, but I hadn't heard that much about Qatar or the UAE before. And in 2011, if you remember what was happening, especially in Libya, I mean, Qatar was instrumental in, pushing global powers to act in Libya in 2011. And then, of course, Qatar and Saudi Arabia were very active in Syria as well. And so that got me thinking, what's the rationale behind what these countries that we don't know so much about, what is the rationale behind their foreign policies? And very rapidly, especially in the Egyptian case, we saw that not only were they increasingly influential on the regional stage, but that they did not have the same goals. And so that's pretty much what happened. What got me into the topic of trying to compare what was happening that made it so Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, which from a very, outsider's perspective from afar, seemed to share a lot of the same internal and external challenges, security challenges, the same had a lot of characteristics in common, not least of which, of course, the fact that the citizens were a minority in the country, but that also, the security dilemmas were dictated a lot by the triangle of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq, then becoming the opposition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it was really interesting to me to try and understand, why is it that these two countries that really look similar from the outside are adopting such dissimilar foreign policy, and in a context where their foreign policy were increasingly influential on the regional, but also on the global stage, in fact. And so That's really where it came from. And then, of course, and we'll probably get to talk more about this, but what was really fascinating to me is one of the prisms through which I looked at the foreign policy and defense policies was the arms trade in the region. And that's I tie it back to what I was doing before, my research on Lebanon. And what I discovered very rapidly is that the arms trade in the Gulf region had a lot to do with security dynamics, but not in the way that we think about them from, a French perspective, for instance, or from a Western perspective in general. That the arms trade relied on a lot of different incentives that were not necessarily to ensure the defense of the territory by themselves, etc. There was a lot of transactional aspects to and political aspects to the arms trade there, and that's I mean I'll get back into this more, but I think the political economy of the arms trade in that region became one of the main thread of my PhD research at the time. Fast forward to the end of my PhD, I defended my PhD in 2017, and of course, we know what was happening in the region back then. In 2017 was the Gulf crisis, and it's interesting to me because, of course, when you do a PhD, your anxiety perhaps can be that by the time you're finished, everything you wrote is completely it's irrelevant because things just changed. And in my case, what I realized is that the more events were unfolding in the region, the more in fact it confirmed a lot of what I wrote in my research. And this growing opposition, not just the divergence between Qatar and the UAE, but their growing opposition, which of course the Gulf crisis was an illustration of. So it kind of prompted me, as you might also know, after a PhD, you're not necessarily keen on right away jumping into, okay, let's make it a book, especially because my PhD was written in French, and so that meant translating everything, updating everything, etc. And but with everything that was happening in the region and how much, in fact, the dynamics that I had been observing for 5 years were confirming and in fact accelerating, it prompted me to turn it into a book. That's the origin story.
Yes. Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot to unpack here when it comes to what you just said, the similarities and the differences between those two states, and also the evolution, because as you said, the way we discuss and the way probably you discussed Qatar and UAE 10, 15 years ago is very different from what we discuss today. And especially when we read your conclusion, the conclusion of the book takes stock of those evolutions. Let me ask a question, which is on, let's say, the analytical framework of the book, because the first part of the book looks at how academia can discuss those two states. And what caught my attention is that there's a discussion in the book about small state security. And again, in Singapore, people are familiar with this discussion because Singapore is discussing and sees itself as a small state, and discussions about survival, resilience when it comes to small states. But what caught my attention is one footnote actually in the book where you share this anecdote, you discussing with interviewees in the UAE. And you explain that they didn't like this expression of small states being applied to the case of the UAE. So I was curious how does that tell us about self-perceptions? Maybe just in the UAE, but would you say that there's also this, let's say, rejection of small state terminology when it comes to Qatar, or is it just the UAE, you would say?
That's interesting. Yes, that this footnote caught your attention. In fact, it talks a lot about the strategy of both countries. You know, I think at some point in the book I mentioned that if both of these countries were in fact seeing themselves as small on the international stage, we would not be where we are today. You know, their politics would not have been what we've seen over the past few decades. And I think, I mean, the book really develops a lot. What do we actually call a small state? You know, what is even the definition of a small state? Because, of course, you can take a demographic perspective, but even in terms of demography, as I already mentioned, both Qatar and the UAE have this particularity that their citizens are a minority in the country. So when we talk about demographics of both countries, are we just talking about the citizens? Are we talking about everyone, including expats, etc.? So you have the demography aspect, and of course you have the sheer territorial size of the countries, and especially if you compare them to other countries such as Saudi Arabia nearby and Iran and Iraq, it is a fact that they are small territory countries. But that being said, even in the conversation in the book about what do we call a small state, I jump into relative power and also perception. I think, of course, I don't think that I'm teaching anyone anything by saying that the one way in which both of these countries are not at all small is in economic, the in the finance and economy departments, and how much, of course, the rent has helped them get to the regional and the international status that they have today. And so it's in fact this tension between the smallness of their demography and of their territory and the vastness of the economic resources that has in fact allowed them to deploy a lot of implement a lot of their foreign policy choices, etc. In terms of perception, I mean, I mentioned, you know, Robert Jervis, of course, perception and misperception in international relations, and what we get from, you know, of course, I'm going to paraphrase here, but what we get from this literature is that perception is everything that matters in international relations, because you know, for instance, when you talk about security dilemmas, which is at the heart of, you know, security studies, you need to understand the perception of governments, of leaders on both sides of the equation, and the security dilemma being this acceleration of, oh, for instance, I'm going to buy a lot of weapons because I feel threatened by my neighbor. But then my buying a lot of weapons is perceived as not as defensive move, but as an offensive move. And so therefore my neighbor will also buy a lot of weapons as a defense against my perceived, you know, offensive stance. What I mean by this is that perception is everything. It doesn't matter what the reality is to a certain extent, because what matters is what kind of policy you implement based on your perception. And I think the Gulf countries, especially, I mean, in Qatar and the UAE, my two case studies, it is very very apparent. And so I do believe that the policies that they've implemented for the past 2 decades shows that they don't think of themselves as small countries. I think I quoted, you know, certain discourses, speeches of Qatari and Emirati representatives in front of the United Nations, for instance, and you really see you really hear in those speeches the greatness that they do believe their countries to be capable of, and really making a change. And I think, if anything, the past decades has shown how much they can have an impact on the region and the world.
Thank you. Let's talk about the differences because this is a book that compares two states. And as you said, I mean, at first sight, people that don't know much about the Gulf may be assuming that those are two small states sharing the same language, sharing the same culture. So we could assume that they have very similar trajectories. But you explain very clearly in the book that this is actually two states that made very different choices. If I can very quickly quote from the book, you explain in the book, Abu Dhabi has focused on developing hard power capabilities while Doha has emphasized soft power. You go on saying Emiratis prioritize credibility and state building with a domestic focus, while the Qataris prioritize legitimacy and state branding with an international focus. I really love this quote because I think you captured very well the two very different trajectories. How could you explain how did you come up with the assessment of those two very different trajectories?
So thank you for this question. Well, I mean, what I started seeing very early on in the research is how much we were starting to talk at the end of the 2000s or early 2010s about the differences between Qatar and the UAE. We could see, the difference of, what different groups they backed, supported on the regional stage, but also the differences between the interventions abroad, etc. And what appeared to me is that that was not new, in fact, and that what I mentioned in the book is, for me, one of the first sign that, in fact, the divergence of choices started in the 1990s and only just confirmed themselves and just accelerated in the 2000s and then had a major impact, is the fact that you had the creation of the IDEX, in the UAE, the International Defense Exhibition, in the early 1990s, and that has become such a huge arms fair. A lot of defense industrials around the world will go to the IDEX every 2 years, and it's an event at which you can observe the evolution also of trends in the UAE arms trade, but beyond that also regional trends. And so I thought it was really interesting that this started in the early 1990s, while in Qatar, what was happening at the same time was the creation of Al Jazeera. And so I feel like it's only a symbol of the divergent choices, but you had, from that moment on, they really rooted their strategy, one in soft power and the other one in hard power. And the reason why this is also important is that it manifested as a decision of the princes of the prince state that I was looking at, because IDEX has very much been the baby, the pet project, if I may say, of Mohammed bin Zayed, the now president of the UAE, but who wasn't president, of course, at the time. And it has become a vessel of his own ascending to power within the country, but also consolidating the foreign policy, a very hard power focused foreign policy of his country, the foreign policy destiny, really, of his country, firmly rooted in hard power, while Qatar's focus on media diplomacy and also mediation was very much linked to Hamad bin Khalifa. And so for me it was a nice symbol of these diverging trajectories. What I do say is that before I even getting into, well, it was linked to the personality and the vision and the networks of the respective princes that I identify in each country. It also has a lot to do with the small differences between the two countries. Even though we can say from the outside, Qatar and the UAE do have fairly similar determinants, both inside and outside, there are still major differences, or not major, but differences between them. One being that, in terms of terminology, you could in fact talk about Qatar as a micro state, not even a small state, in terms of the size of their territory and their population, while the UAE is relatively bigger. So let's say a small state and a micro state, as I mentioned it in the book. But there's also the fact that one is one emirate, while the other is a federation of emirates. And so from these two differences, you can perhaps from these two differences stem some stem some of the differences of their choices, because as a federation, the UAE needed to consolidate more of a sense of a national identity, and that national identity was very much enforced through, or encouraged through, the consolidation of the armed forces. So it was really a vessel of nation building, in fact, and state building, while Qatar, being much smaller and a single emirate, could right away focus more on state branding and reaching out to the rest of the world. And yeah, so that's one aspect. And there's really this dichotomy between credibility and legitimacy, and that also stems from one being so small, in fact, that I don't believe Qatari leadership ever thought that they could defend themselves on their own, because of the sheer smallness of the population, armed forces, and so they needed outside help and network, and as much help as they could. Hence the importance of legitimacy and having good relationships with as many people as possible, and this idea that they needed to be friends with everyone, which really put them at the heart of mediation, in diplomacy, much more than the UAE, which was more focused on being seen as a credible actor on the regional stage, and more focused on the domestic stage, even though there were some aspect of state branding as a hard power country through IDEX, but through a lot of other initiatives. At the end of the day, you have layers in their state building and in their state branding. They have a lot of similarity, but they differentiated themselves. That's the last thing I'll say, but they differentiated themselves also to a certain extent because they needed to differentiate themselves from the neighbor. I talk about the narcissism of the small difference. They needed to promote a brand that was slightly different from the neighbor's brand. We're part of the Gulf, and we'll probably come back to Khaliji identity and the importance of their collective destiny, their collective interests. But they also needed to be identified as separate entities.
Well, one thing which is interesting again in the book is that those differences, and you could argue that this is the idea of competition among Gulf states, But as you explain in details, that actually turned into more than just a competition. That turned into open hostility with the 2017 crisis, the blockade of Qatar. And reading that episode in the book, I was struck by the fact that, I mean, the blockade has been terminated in 2021, so 4 years ago, and it almost feels like ancient history. Could you go back, maybe walk us through this episode, which is not so far, not so long ago, and how do you see the current and maybe future relations between the UAE and Qatar? I mean, is it water under the bridge that this crisis is over? This was just a temporary episode that doesn't reflect the long-term history of both countries, or do you think there was something much deeper behind it?
I mean, I feel like it's a little bit of both. There is definitely something deep in the opposition. I mean, the whole that's what I go through throughout the book, is to show how they took different stance from a domestic perspective, but also on the regional stage. And of course, the transformation of the regional landscape in 2011 made that much more visible. And so when we arrive at the Gulf crisis in 2017, in reality, both countries had been at odds with one another in several countries already. I was mentioning Egypt, which for me is one of the most obvious case where we saw that opposition. I talk about, a progression in like a three acts happening in Egypt, where you have first say the group, the Muslim Brotherhood, that was really supported by Qatar, that that came into power with the election of Morsi. And so how that was really that could have been seen as a victory from a influence perspective, a diplomatic perspective for Qatar. And then you had Saudi Arabia and the UAE really pushing for the opposition and really helping the coup by al-Sisi. And so, and having been much more much more clearly patrons of the Egyptian government ever since. And so you saw these tensions in Egypt. You also saw them, in fact, in Tunisia before that, in Libya, even though Qatar and the UAE both intervened in Libya in 2011. Very rapidly, they started supporting different groups on the ground, and we saw that for a very long time in Libya. And so you already had these tensions everywhere. What I think happened in 2017, I mean, you need to mention that it started happening in 2014, right? Because there was already the mini Gulf crisis in 2014, when Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain they recalled their ambassadors from Qatar. So you already had a mini Gulf crisis at that time, which was resolved very rapidly in a couple of months. And then for a few years, we didn't really hear much about that. But then 2017, I think two things happened that 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 um, that yeah that led to the beginning of the Gulf crisis. One was that in 2017 you had a new, what I call, a prince state on the block that really needed to show force and show that they were a new force to be reckoned with, was the Saudi prince state under Mohammed bin Salman. And you had seen the assertion of this new Gulf prince states under Mohammed bin Salman with the Vision 2030, with the Yemen war, and to such an extent, the beginning of the Gulf crisis is a manifestation of this. But even more so, it was prompted by the arrival of Donald Trump and the big meeting that happened in Saudi Arabia around Donald Trump. If you remember, there was a Saudi US meeting, but also a GCC meeting, and also an Islamic world conference. And the president, Donald Trump at the time, called to, antagonize, isolate countries that were supporting terrorism, etc. So, of course, what he meant at the time was Iran in 2017, but that's not what what Saudi Arabia and the UAE decided to do. Right after that, that's when they decided to start the blockade on Qatar, and we had the beginning of the Gulf crisis. So I think what happened really, everything, all the pieces were there, but you had both a regional and a global environment that suddenly emboldened them to make a move to try and bring Qatar into their rank. Say, okay, you've had your, I mean, of course, I wouldn't say it as casually, but kind of saying you've had your fun. You've defended a number of things in the region that are not aligned with what we want for the region for the past few years. Now you just come back, stop playing. You just come back into the rank and kind of forcefully put a cap on this the specific brand of diplomacy of Qatar in the region. What's of course extremely interesting is that they did not succeed really, and so that's we saw, in fact, ironically, the blockade kind of accelerated. Helped, I think, Qatari national the consolidation of their national identity and rallying the flag and the new emir, which was also an important aspect. I think the miscalculation of the UAE and Saudi Arabia at the time is that with the new emir Tamim, they had an opportunity to force the small Qatar into their rank because of what they deemed perhaps to be a lack of support to the new emir, and that it would be easy, and it turned out not to be, of course. What I'll say about the reconciliation in 2021 is, I do not believe, I'll say this, I do not believe that they reconciled because Trump wasn't the president anymore. But I say that there was a collateral benefit to the Gulf crisis in the book, which is that in 2017, as I just mentioned, Trump seemed very, very eager to fully isolate Iran. We saw it with the maximum pressure campaign, and massive sanctions, him leaving the US unilaterally leaving the JCPOA, etc. And so there was really clearly this willingness from the Trump administration to isolate Iran. Somehow, one of the collateral benefits, I'd argue, of the Gulf crisis is that it divided the Gulf front. The GCC were not a united front, and so it made it impossible for the US to push them to join an anti-Iran front at the time, which they were clearly trying to do, including through all the normalization agreements with Israel. And I think to a certain extent in 2021, the rationale for this was no longer there because a lot of things had changed with the pandemic and with and also the reputation of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE having been really damaged by the Yemen war. And so at that time they needed a fresh start in terms of state branding. So they needed to reconcile, even though not much had changed on the Qatari side.
Thank you. We're getting closer to the end of our conversation, so let me remind our participants, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat box, and I'll relay those questions. Just to follow up on your point, and to get closer actually to today's environment, because as you explained with the model of the UAE, it was initially much more on hard power, but as we saw over the last years, the UAE, especially at the level of public diplomacy, has been more and more leaning toward mediation efforts, diplomatic ambitions, and soft power. And to a certain extent, it actually echoes a lot of what Qatar has been doing for more than 2 decades. So I'm curious, what do you make of this UAE evolution shift? Again, do you think this is a profound evolution of the UAE, or is it more complex than that? It's not as if the UAE is just turning the chapter of its hard power position and getting closer to the Qatari model. How do you see that?
Yeah, I do not see it as a shift. I'd say to keep it short, I would say that it's not a shift, it's a layering of their strategy. Um, Part of it is having been I'm forced to realize that especially the Yemen war brought them a lot of bad press. And in terms of UAE, but also Qatari power, reputation is everything. Something that damages their reputation is very it's a very severe blow to their stance. And so I talk about the UAE grabbing a book, grabbing a page from the Qatari playbook, with being more and more involved in mediation and soft power initiatives. What's interesting is that Qatar did the same. Also started stealing some pages from the UAE rule book, with announcements of consolidating a national defense industry. We've seen a little bit of beginning of hard power strategy, consolidation of hard power strategy in Qatar. And so I think they both take a little bit from the other. But yeah, I would talk more about a layering than a complete shift. I mean, we see if only that what the UAE is doing, well, it has done for a long time in Libya, but also in Sudan these days. And clearly the hard power strategy is not over, also in terms of continuing to buy and now manufacture and export weapons. I mean, it's just another layer. I think they're adding to their toolkit rather than making a drastic shift.
We have a question from Robert, and that's actually, I think, a nice follow-up to what you just said, which is about the mediation efforts, the mediation approach of both Qatar and the UAE, but Robert also adds Saudi Arabia. And which strategy, if you had to pick, which strategy would you say has proved most effective of those three countries when it comes to mediation efforts?
I mean, I'd say that in the book, what I do is that I do compare a little bit the rise of Qatar as a mediator as opposed to the historical country of Saudi Arabia and Egypt that were before that really established as mediators in the region. And what I explained then is that the advantage for Qatar is that precisely a much smaller country and could have more direct relations with stakeholders, and had this already established this reputation of being friends with everyone, for survival reasons. There was a good reason for them to have maintained relations with opposite sides. I mean, we've seen that, of course, a lot in the Palestinian case. One of the first mediation efforts that put Qatar on the map in this perspective is the Palestinian, mediating between Palestinian factions. And so I'd place the difference between the smoother and quicker mediation from smaller countries as opposed to historical Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I'd say the UAE and Qatar probably have the same arguments to bring to the table when it comes to that, but except that Qatar has been doing it for longer, and that perhaps, in fact, both with what happened between 2011 and 2020, really, they both behaved on the regional stage in a way that dented their reputation as being able to talk to everyone. Perhaps that's what I would say. What I would add is that what I find interesting in both of the strategies, and also Saudi Arabia, one thing that I mention in the book is, to a certain extent, I wonder, it's more a hypothesis than a statement, but I wonder to what extent part of what we're seeing now since 2020, coming back to competition, but not open confrontation between Qatar and the UAE, but also between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, stems from the fact that they've collectively won in terms of, we had the Gulf Arab moment, but now we really have, to a certain extent, a Gulfized Middle East order. They have in fact oversaturated the regional space to such an extent that the Gulf countries are seen nowadays as the center of gravity, as the new center of gravity of the Middle East. And so to that extent, of course, they would disagree. It doesn't not matter whether it's Qatar or the UAE, but it also makes a lot to continue reinforcing the Gulf Arab moment, which is no longer just a Gulf Arab moment. It's a Gulf regional center of gravity that's been consolidated over the past decades.
Let's talk actually about the Gulf states and the Middle East order. And while I was preparing for this book talk, while I was reading the book, I thought we would have to discuss how the UAE and Qatar perceive the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict. I wasn't expecting actually that the book talk would happen only a few hours after Qatar has been the target, or at least more specifically the US military base in Qatar, target of an Iranian missile strike. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what do you make of the UAE and Qatar perception of this conflict? And this may be very different actually, because I mean the UAE here is the country that normalized relations with Israel, that after the signing of the Abraham Accords had this talking point that normalization was going to improve the Palestinian the progress towards a Palestinian state. Now there's a lot of speculation about how do Gulf states perceive Israel, how they are concerned about the escalation over the last days. What is your take on the Gulf position on this ongoing conflict?
I mean, what I think is the most important thing for all of the Gulf countries is to make sure that we don't reach a point of escalation that would directly threaten their territory. Going back to, you talked, of course, about the fact that the UAE signed the Abraham Accord with Israel and had this whole narrative about it was going to help Palestinian. I don't know that maybe they believed in it. I don't know that anyone else believed in it. Certainly not Palestinians. But I, what I think is important, from the very beginning of their signing the Abraham Accords, to me, the end game of, or there were a lot of different reasons why the UAE signed the Abraham Accords. But part of the rationale was not about Israel; it was about the United States. And so I'm saying this because what I think it did do, this signing the Abraham Accord, is that it bought even more room to maneuver for the UAE with regards to the United States. Because it kind of said, you know, we're doing what you've been wanting us to do a long time. It gives you something to celebrate. You can put your name on, you know, regional peace, even though the UAE was not at war with Israel in the first place. So that's not a peace agreement. It's just a normalization agreement. And so it's, you know, it kind of goes back to this question of perception. It doesn't matter what the reality is. What matters is what they can spin it as in terms of political narrative. And so that was part of the rationale for signing the Abraham Accords in the first place. Now, for the UAE, I think Israel-Palestine is one of the issue on which we still see divergence between the UAE and Qatar. And of course, it's been really interesting to see how Qatar conducted, you know, the World Cup and really put itself forward as a, you know, championing the Palestinian cause at that time. So you have this not, I mean, what could have seen at the time as a minor divergence, but in the current context is of course not minor at all, since a lot of what's happening right now is of course about Palestine. So they all don't want escalation. You have this divergence of how they both have contacts with Israel, of course. You know, we know how much Qatar has exchanged and been, you know, coordinating to a certain extent with Israel and in terms of its link to Hamas in the first place. I mean, I don't think that I'm saying anything that new here. What I think was interesting yesterday, in fact, I saw it. Of course, I looked at the reaction to the strike, and what I thought was interesting was that I almost thought that the UAE response, the first response, was almost more forceful than the Qatari one. The Qatari said, you know, this is a clear violation of international law, and we reserve ourselves the right to reply in time. And you had a couple of, well, we're talking about Abdul Khalik Abdullah, and one of his first tweets, I think, was saying an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, which, of course, you know, in the context of everything that we've discussed of the past decade, is really interesting. But it was really a very forceful and almost a call to a militarized response to what had just happened. And to a certain extent, it still shows this divergence of, you know, soft power and diplomacy versus militarized response kind of reading or frame of mind within the two countries.
And I have one question from the audience, and I believe this will be the last one, as time is we're nearing the end of the conversation. But this is a general question on basically, if you could reflect on the strategies of those two states over the last 2 decades, during the time that you worked on both the UAE and Qatar. If you had to reflect on their evolution, what do you think worked and what didn't? Is there like blatant mistakes that those countries made where they overestimated their leverage? And otherwise, are there cases where you were surprised actually by their successes?
Thank you. I wouldn't say I was surprised by the successes. I think across the board, for better or for worse, I'll say that they've been very successful. Um, I think they have, going back to the quote that you mentioned, I think they've both succeeded in establishing themselves as they wanted to be established, they've made a name for themselves in diplomacy and mediation, in credibility of the armed forces to a certain extent, the UAE, especially with Yemen, up to a certain point. And even building today a defense industrial base, I think there are a lot of proponents they have a lot of supporters for these endeavors. So to a certain extent, they've been rather successful. And I think perhaps the major point that they've been successful in, both of them, is that they navigated the transformations of the international order with the multipolarization of the international order and what is sometimes called, I don't know if we would call it that now, but was sometimes called a post-US order. They've really navigated these shifts pretty skillfully. And they did position themselves as indispensable regional actors and global actors to a certain extent. But where I think where their strategy is lacking to a certain extent is that what hasn't worked, for instance, if you take the UAE, what hasn't worked is and is continuing to damage their reputation, again, to a certain extent, is their militarized reflexes. The continuing to, I mean, what they did in Yemen to a certain extent, but especially in Libya and today in Sudan, is continuing to really impact their reputation, their image negatively. And what I find, and that's kind of what I develop in the last chapter of the book, is to say that what is interesting is that they've skillfully navigated this new international order. They've successfully positioned themselves as forces to be reckoned with, and they position themselves a lot just in terms of visibility, but on new aspects, food security, on renewables, and other aspects of security where they really could make even more of a name for themselves if they just started saying, we're going to impact the international order, not just in terms of who's leading, but also how. And by adopting still the same militarized reflexes as previous world powers have done for centuries now, I think that is eventually negative for them because they have a huge opportunity to do things differently as new, trendsetters. They could be trendsetters in having a different world order rather than continuous militarized.
Fantastic. And I think this is the perfect conclusion for this discussion, and hopefully also a perfect way also to encourage everyone to read the book by Dr. Soubrier. Let me just remind the title: Qatar and the United Arab Emirates: Diverging Paths to Regional and Global Powers. I really highly recommend the book to anyone that want to know more about those two countries, but also about, I'd say the Gulf and the evolution of the Middle East over the last 2 decades, I'd say. So it's impossible to understand what's happening today without having this element in the background. Emma, Dr. Soubrier, thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this book talk. To everyone, you have actually in the chat box the link, the detail of the book. Thank you all for joining us for this event, and have a great day or great evening, depending on where you are. Thank you all.